Okay, thank you for waiting. We have some connection problems, sorry. So I should have said that participants opponents will have 7 minutes to expose, and then we will have maybe some minutes for questions from the audience.
Atende a porta.
So please, Claudia, if you are there, just take the floor. Claudia, are you there? Claudia, can you hear us?
Claudia, ¿nos escuchas?
Yes. Sim, escuto. Tá com eco.
So, Claudia, please, you can take the floor now.
Escuto com eco. Tem um eco, mas escuto.
¿Me escucha?
Sí.
Ahí está. Bueno, ya puedo empezar a hablar. ¿Usted me escucha a mí? ¿Me escucha bien?
Sim.
Ok, bueno, ya puedo empezar a hablar.
Eu não entendo o que eu tenho que fazer.
Che, hola, fíjate, no tenés habilitado. Claro, tenés habilitado el video. No sabe que le habla, ¿no?
Okay, Claudia, are you with us?
Sí.
Can you hear us?
Sí.
Great. Thank you. Come on.
Recordate. Sí, soy yo. Voy a poder empezar.
Oh, okay. I think that I made my presentation, but I think that you couldn't assist. So I will summarize because we don't have any time. What we tried to do in our article was to compare some results from research in Brazil with the global report from Posset and all, and we find that all the problems that Posset point in her global report are present in Brazil, especially the role of far-right extremists doing this work to be violent with female journalists, especially female journalists that are engaged in political cover. What we point to is some resistance that appears in Brazil since for example, the first one was in 2016 when a group of journalists, female journalists, start a campaign in Twitter using the hashtag harassment in professional, like a lot of female journalists that start to make deployments and what they suffer doing their professions, gender and misogyny and harassment. The other was another campaign in Twitter made especially by female journalists that cover sports, and the campaign was let her work, because female journalists that cover sports are very subject to a lot of violent expressions from the men that are in the sports environment. These two campaigns are very important, but what we see that is more consistent reaction is in 2020. We see a network of journalists with gender and race vision. So this is a network of female journalists and communication people that communication field, activists, academic, that are trying to link all the violence that are perpetrated with against female journalists with other intersectional marks. In Brazil, this is a very, very important issue. So I think that our work consists in discuss these questions, but we are very, I don't have more time to discuss it, so I can finish my presentation to be able to listen to the other presentations of the panel. Thank you very much.
Okay, Claudia. Thank you, I'm sorry. And now we are listening to Edward Carter.
Ahora vamos a escuchar a Edward Carter, que es un profesor de la Facultad de Comunicación. Y vamos a presentar un marco basado en género para terminar la impunidad de los ataques a los periodistas.
You have 10 minutes.
Great. Is this one working? Thank you. Well, this is a pleasure for me to be here, and I'm grateful for the chance to just share a few thoughts on the mode of solutions with respect to impunity and attacks on journalists. And I think the solutions question, it really consists of two things. One is having the will, in the legal system to achieve justice for attacks on journalists. And then secondarily would be the methods to be able to do that. And so my research here is focused primarily on a method that grows out of transitional journalism, transitional justice. Transitional justice, you might be familiar with, is used in countries emerging from periods of human rights abuses, mass violations of human rights, and really it's just about achieving justice. I had a professor named Pablo de Grief who taught us about transitional justice, and he said transitional justice is just justice, but it's kind of a special way of thinking about how to do that. So I want to start off with a brief story about a journalist in Colombia named Gineth Bedoya. Maybe some of you are familiar with her history. She worked at El Espectador in 20 years ago, in 2000. She went to a prison in Bogota called La Modelo prison, and there had been a riot or a conflict the previous month where right-wing paramilitaries had caused violence and 32 inmates were killed. During this Colombian civil war between the FARC and the right-wing paramilitaries associated with the government, this had happened, and so she thought she was invited to go to the prison to do an interview with some of the leaders who had caused this conflict, but it turned out she was lured there and kidnapped at gunpoint and taken for 10 hours and mistreated, and then found later on the side of a highway. And she, obviously experienced great trauma associated with this, but she determined to seek justice. The Colombian police and prosecutors were not very helpful in doing the investigation, and it took 20 years really for justice to arrive. But in October of 2021, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights made a decision in the Bedoya case, Caso de Bedoya Lima contra Colombia. And the decision is really important because the court outlines a transitional justice framework. And so there are 4 steps to that I want to just review and suggest that these could be useful ways to think about how we can end impunity in attacks on journalists. So the four elements of transitional justice are, first, criminal prosecutions, actually bringing people to accountability in the legal system. Number 2 is reparations, so trying to make whole the person who's been harmed. And then 3 would be truth-telling, the idea that we need to get the truth out about what happened in human rights abuse situations. And then number 4 is some kind of a guarantee of non-recurrence, that there are steps taken so this won't happen again. So those were the basic 4 elements of the Inter-American Court decision for Gineth Bedoya. And the way that it was applied, though, in her case is, I think, interesting and important. So on the criminal prosecutions aspect, the Inter-American Court said that Colombia had violated her human rights under the American Declaration of Human Rights because the prosecution had not been full and prompt, investigation and prosecution of who did this, who was responsible. And the court looked at the gender aspect of the failure for Colombia to investigate and prosecute, and that was really important because obviously the case was a gender-based attack, and so the court said the solution needed to also take into account the importance of not re-victimizing her during the investigation and the prosecution. The court also noted that she and her mother had been subjected to additional threats and intimidation, and she had even been kidnapped later again in 2003, and that these gender-based aspects of targeting her were not accounted for by the Colombian police and prosecutors. The court also faulted Colombia in terms of the lack of promptness of the investigation, and there are other opinions in the European Court of Human Rights on this. But dragging your feet for 20 years is not achieving justice, and so that was a problem. Even though some of the lower level people involved had been arrested, and there had been some attempts at prosecutions, there wasn't like a full accountability. So the end result of that was the court said, well, that was a violation of the right to freedom of the press, among other rights, and needs to be remedied. So the country was ordered to, conduct the investigation. Number two, on reparations, she was given money damages for the actual harm that was done to her, and then also additional financial compensation. And finances really can't restore somebody or make them whole. It doesn't put the person back to where they were before, but in terms of reparations, it is an important, I think, symbol of, the fact that we're trying to have some accountability here by the government. And her mother also was given some money for reparations for damages done. And the traumas that were caused, the court recognized there was primary trauma, obviously, to her and being attacked, kidnapped, but then there was secondary trauma to family members and, others around her. Third, there was a truth-telling aspect to the court's opinion, and so what the court did is it ordered Colombia to show a documentary that Gineth Bedoya was involved in producing called No es hora de callar. This is No Time to Be Silent. And she has an organization about that, and it's kind of about empowering and giving agency to victims of sexual violence. And the idea is that, of course, there could be embarrassment or shame, a lot of things associated with that, and that can sometimes be a hindrance to people reporting those kind of crimes and seeking accountability and justice. And so the documentary that she put together was aimed to empower people who are subjected to attacks. So the country's supposed to distribute the documentary as well as engage in other forms of truth-telling. And the court even got so specific to say that you need to have a center for recognition and memory about violence against journalists, especially women journalists, during the Colombian Civil War. And the center should have certain exhibits. It should be, like a museum that's educational for people, teaching what happened so that we remember and we don't have that repeated. And then finally, number 4 was the guarantees of non-recurrence. And so here the court said, well, what the country should do is undertake training of police and prosecutors, and they specified some specific training programs that police should undergo and prosecutors, and part of that had to do with gender consciousness about crimes against journalists, especially women, and then take other measures, just to make sure that something like this wouldn't happen again in terms of internal reforms within the legal system. So obviously this is an imperfect, an imperfect world that we live in, but an imperfect approach, right, to trying to end impunity and achieving justice. But I think it's a useful framework and a good starting place for conversations, especially about journalists and gender issues. And Gineth Bedoya recently was named as a United Nations Global Ambassador to combat sexual violence. And so, she has a profile and a platform now to, I think, make a positive difference. And if this inter-American court opinion is actually implemented, of course, this is always the challenge, but if the country is sincere and takes it seriously and other countries recognize this, then it could be a way forward in terms of, ensuring accountability and justice. It was cited yesterday by the Secretary General of UNESCO that up to 90% of killings of journalists over the last 15 years are unresolved. And so obviously that problem of impunity needs to be addressed, and really starts with the online threats, the minor aggressions, the things that lead up to, a more serious crime. And so if impunity can be achieved on the early levels, then hopefully, or if justice can be achieved, then hopefully we won't have this culture of impunity. So I'll stop there, but look forward to any thoughts that you might have about transitional justice as applied to attacks on journalists. Also, just a quick plug here, I will say I'm a special issue editor for an upcoming edition of an academic journal on ending impunity and attacks on journalists. And so love to have anyone involved in that who's got interest in submitting something that you would want to write. Journalism.byu.edu has some details, so you can check that out, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Edward. Now we are going to focus on this presentation called "You Are a Marriage Failure: Theorizing the Notion of Mob Violence from Uganda's Female TV Journalist Stories." I think we have there Florence Namasinga Selnes, that is postdoctoral research fellow at the Oslo Metropolitan University in Norway. Florence, are you there? Can you hear us?
Yes, the question is, can everyone hear me?
Edward can hear you too.
Yeah, great.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't need any more introductions. I will share my screen. In this paper, I would like to say quickly that this paper, we are comparing, we're relating mob justice to, we are relating mob justice or mob violence to online violence that is experienced by journalists generally in Uganda. So it's this specific, we are focusing on female TV journalists, but the main research really looked at female journalists in general from across the board, from the different media platforms. Can everyone see my screen, or am I? Yes, great. It is titled "Your Marriage Failure." Like I said, we are relating online mob violence experienced by Uganda female journalists, relating it to mob justice, a phenomena that is prevalent in the Ugandan society. So the paper interrogates TV journalists' experiences with violence by the mob. We focus on 3 female journalists, but like I said, we only zoom in on 3 journalists' experiences, but our research was really focused on very many journalists that we interviewed. So we collected their experiences, their stories, or their tales of encounters with violence and harassment in online spaces. We draw on the notion of mob justice, which is a widespread phenomenon in Uganda, to explain or offer our reflections and thoughts on the prevalence of violence against journalists online and in general in Uganda. So mob justice, mob violence in Uganda is synonymous with mob justice or justice by the mob, which connotes extrajudicial punishment of someone suspected of wrongdoing by a crowd. So the punishment is usually in form of beating that often ends in death. The crowd acts as the plaintiff, as the judge, and the executor of a sentence. So usually the role or the goal of perpetrators of mob justice or mob violence is censorship. They want to silence their victim or their victims. In relation to journalism, there are emerging cases of physical violence in which citizens, or rather the mob, we use the word the mob in this paper specifically with a purpose, in which the mob attacks journalists either as individuals or in a group or as a mob. So here, this picture, some of these pictures, I use them with a purpose, not just for decoration. Here in this picture, you see a police officer chasing with a gun, with guns. There were many chasing a journalist, and these are common occurrences in Uganda, especially when during elections or during demonstrations. So generally, there is growing interest in research about journalist safety and press freedom in Uganda. But most of that research focuses on state perpetrated violence over violence by state actors, known state actors. In this case, we focus on violence by the mob or violence by usually unidentified groups of people who target journalists. So from a gender perspective, increasingly women the world over experience violence. And in specific terms here, we see that whereas all journalists across the board experience violence online, women or female journalists are 27 times more likely than men to be harassed online. So that is the general picture worldwide. So when it comes to Uganda, when we zero down in Uganda, you find that the female journalists in Uganda experience harassment in form of sexist comments. They are insulted, and the focus usually of the perpetrators is women body. There is age shaming and body shaming, sometimes character assassination, and even professional assassination that borders on tarnishing the name and even the professional credibility of the journalists themselves. And in Uganda specifically, research shows that women journalists who experience abuse online do not get justice, even when there are provisions in the legal provisions for them to seek redress legally. They often struggle to have their complaints taken seriously. So how we collected that data is basically, it was by interviewing. We interviewed a number of journalists, but for the purpose of what we submitted to this conference, we focus on stories of 3 female journalists, 3 TV journalists. So there are 3 women who have practiced journalism for a while, drawn from 3 different television stations. So I'll go straight to what we have found out. The first story here. One journalist, female journalist, she has been a journalist. She's renowned. She's a news anchor, a very renowned news anchor. She also moderates TV programs. So her programs are very famous, both on social media. When they are live on television, they are also streamed live on the different social media platforms, specifically Facebook. So we asked them to share stories, recent stories, at the time of data collection, stories that they remembered vividly, and this is what came to her mind when she shared it. It was during elections, a very, very, very high political season in Uganda. She says that such a political season is characterized by bitter exchange and violence from all political camps. I tweeted my opinion stating that the issue at the moment shouldn't be about whether Uganda needs change, but how it can be changed. I am convinced that the camp, Kyagulanyi here, who is mentioned, was one of the main political presidential aspirants in the 2021 presidential elections in Uganda. So the journalist continues to say that I'm convinced that the Kyagulanyi camp misinterpreted my tweet. They abused, they insulted, harassed me, attacked me from all platforms, including during my live stream TV broadcasts. I had never been gagged like that before. I was branded a traitor of the people of Uganda. Some propagandists went live on Facebook, attacked me, they attacked my family, my work, and my personality. It was a traumatizing moment, seeing me being attacked with all sorts of vulgarity on every post that I made after that tweet. I was branded a traitor, a government apologist, a marriage failure, a bitch, a slut, and a foreigner, etc. The story goes on. And so the second one also, it is different. This one is a bit different, how she was attacked. The attack in this second story really goes down. It goes down to attacking someone as a person, someone's appearance. I did a piece to camera and the story was posted online. The comments on the story were shocking. You have so many pimples. What do you use your salary for? The journalist continues to say that I felt so offended because this person did not know how much I'm struggling with pimples in real life. I'll go first to the third story and summarize it. This one is very special because it happened during a live broadcast on the street in the field. The journalist was attacked in the field while she was doing a live reporting, a live coverage. And then as she was being attacked, she tried to defend herself the best way she could. And as that happened, as the fracas happened in the physical spaces, there was another fracas on social media. And what hurt me, what hurt her, the journalist says, what hurt her the most is that there were even commentators on Facebook who said, who blamed her for what happened to her while she was reporting. Yeah, I'll go very quickly to our reflections from those stories in the interest of time. So we observe, our observations here actually go beyond these three stories we focus on here. We say generally that perpetrators of violence against female TV journalists, generally online, they focus on their physical appearance. And we also noted that during highly charged political seasons, like during elections, attacks on journalists in general and female journalists in particular are even higher. So we also observed that violence against female journalists in physical spaces is directly related to the harassment that journalists experience in online spaces. The other point that we named, which is very common, and I believe that it has also been observed elsewhere, is the issue of victim blaming. A journalist is trying to defend themselves, but they are attacked, and in the end, they take the blame. They are blamed for what happens to them. So, yeah, politically motivated attacks on journalists are as common online as they are in offline spaces, especially during politically heightened situations like elections, as I mentioned, and like also during demonstrations. I was not able to go in detail, but Uganda is increasingly becoming polarized generally with politicians on different ends of the spectrum. So when something happens, there is a lot of anger that happens generally, and this anger sometimes or usually is directed towards the journalists, the messengers or the deliverers of the message. So the attackers focus on the personal. Sometimes they even go to the extent of the family, where someone comes from, someone's personal life, like their marriage situations. In this case, I'll refer to the first story where a journalist is branded a marriage failure, perhaps because she has had issues in her personal life. So the attacks are characterized by insults. There is a lot of use of vulgar language towards the female journalists. And we say that sometimes oftentimes these attacks keep female journalists off social media, TV journalists off social media. Sometimes they completely keep off social media. Some of the stories up there that we shared up there don't go into the details, but the journalists say that sometimes they fear to go online because of the vitriol that they experience or the anger that is directed at them by the mob, or in some cases they just reduce their usage of the platforms. Sometimes they even have to just keep off certain topics like politics in general in order not to provoke the online mob. They talked about the loss of self-confidence in themselves as individuals, even confidence in themselves as professionals. So they lose the boldness to speak about critical issues for fear of the reaction that they will get. So I think the biggest challenge that is facing journalism in Uganda, I think even this is a trend even elsewhere outside Uganda, and this needs to be investigated further and even urgently paid attention to. Female journalists quitting the newsroom for other vocations because of some of these challenges that they experience both online and even in offline spaces, the safety challenges that they experience. So online harassment, we conclude, reflects high levels of violence that target women in Uganda. There are reports that shows that, which confirms the reports that 3 women in Uganda, 1 in 3 women in Uganda, generally, not just female journalists, are harassed online. We also note or observe that mob violence against women thrives online as a reflection of the pervasiveness of gender-based violence generally in the entire Ugandan society, even in online spaces. Lastly, but not least, of course not lastly, but we'll just end here. We note that perpetrators will resort to the internet or to the different social media platforms to torment journalists because online spaces simply provide them that option. They can hide behind the wall and do whatever they do. They can assume any identity they wish just to torment female journalists. And in most cases in Uganda, they get away with it. Yeah. Thank you very much. I would like to end there. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Florence, and thank you, everybody. Sorry, we have no time for questions from the audience. We have another panel session now, so thank you very much, everybody.